When Season 4 started, the creative forces of DS9 were under pressure to shake the show up, to get people interested in it again. And after batting some ideas around, they went with, after the Organians foretold the friendship between the Klingons and the Federation, to make them enemies again, and to really shake things up, to bring Worf on board as a permanent character. And this was done in what was essentially a mini relaunch of DS9 with The Way of the Warrior, a big, expensive, balls-to-the-walls tale with a massive space battle and invading Klingons. That is not what you're watching today. Now, today we're covering the Sword of Kahless, and its relevance to The Way of the Warrior is that it's part of actually doing something with that. You have to remember that plans for a show are done well ahead of time, so a massive transformation like this, well, it requires a lot of work. While I tend to give Voyager shit, I will give them this. When they said they were introducing a new character and her journey would be important, they hit the ground running and kept that going for the whole season. The complaints sure weren't, they have this new situation and don't know what to do with it. If there were complaints, there was usually the reverse of that. They have this new situation and it's taking over. But this last-minute change to DS9 really shows. Just take a look at the list of episodes after the credits roll on Way of the Warrior. Let's see, we got Time-Skipping Cisco, Dominion Story, Ducat's Bastard, Space Lesbians, Dominion Story, and Roswell. The Klingons have barely been mentioned. And aside of getting a minor subplot with Odo and Hippocratic Oath, Worf had less than 24 lines in all of the other episodes put together. So that's why I'm saying that Sword of Kahless is so important. Way of the Warrior brought Worf to DS9. This show's job was to show why he belonged here. Well, if you're going to do it whole hog seems to be their philosophy. Have the Klingon of this era team up with the surviving Klingon of the previous one. Kor and Worf, two men who prove just how different Klingons can be from each other, and really emphasize how hack it can get sometimes with the cardboard cutouts that are so often used to represent Klingons. Anyway, this episode opens with Kor telling war stories and quirks. And if you've ever been in a bar, then you know that this kind of thing can happen a lot. Old guys suddenly start telling stories to everybody around them.
I remember when I was a young man, just got back from Korea. We worked down by the railroad yard, me and the boys running the loads. One of them was a young feller by the name of Nick Niemeyer, but we all called him Nicotine Nemo, because he smoked so much. We would be working with the flammables. Next thing you know, in comes Nicotine Nemo, and we said to him, "Nicotine Nemo, you can't smoke in here." But that didn't stop Nicotine Nemo. He just lit up right there on the spot. We would be at the hardware store, come down to see what new screws come in. And as we were, wouldn't you know it, in comes Nicotine Nemo. And we said to him, "Nicotine Nemo, you can't smoke in here." But that didn't stop Nicotine Nemo. He lit up right there on the spot.
But Kor's stories are different, exciting tales of the Klingon Empire that was. You remember from last week, right? Draconian rules, public executions, entire worlds organized into slave labor forces. But the emphasis is not on the dirty parts of it. It's on the romance of it. Tales of battle and overcoming long odds to win the glory. And afterwards, the slavery executions, etc. But they don't make part of a good tale. But this one definitely has a happy ending.
We cut out his heart, and all three of us feasted on it together.
Of course, all Klingon stories end this way. You should see their version of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Dax spots Worf and figures that she'll introduce him to Kor, since he has such a reverence for Klingon history, and Kor is living history. But it's only making Worf nervous because, Kor being such a legend and all that, and Worf is an outcast to his people since Way of the Warrior, that would probably be uncomfortable, assuming he wasn't just downright contemptuous of Worf. Luckily, Kor hates Gowron, so he immediately takes a shine to Worf and lets him and Dax in on his secret. He has found out the location of the legendary Sword of Kahless, and he plans to quest for it. Worf wants to join in, of course, since anything with legendary attached to it that you have to find in a cave or something like that is usually cool. Or if not, it's something deadly but cool if you kill it. And anyway, the camaraderie we see between him and Kor really shows a kinship forming between the two. Both of them romantics, even if they're very different men, both knowing how great this would be for their people. But before the teaser ends, the drunken Kor is attacked by a Lethian, who performs a telepathic attack on him. He must have forgotten about it through a either a psychic implant or just being really drunk, because the next day there's no mention of that, only making on with the whole questing thing. His evidence, a piece of cloth, is verified, so they attend the Council of Cisco for permission to form their fellowship, explaining how the Vulcans unearthed some ruins in the Gamma Quadrant.
Kor was the Klingon ambassador to Vulcan.
No wonder he despises Gowron. Kor, I have the perfect job for you, and don't worry, you won't have to worry about the locals smiling too much this time. For a guy who likes drinking and telling tall tales, that's like loving video games and boxing and having to live in an Amish village. Anyway, Worf explains the significance of finding the sword.
It is said its return will bring back a new era of glory for the Klingon Empire. With the sword, the Emperor will be able to unite my people once again.
The significance of the sword needs to be emphasized like it is because its presence will be a driving force for the story, and not just the search for it. Anyway, Cisco sees how the Federation helping recover could help patch up relations with the Klingons, so he approves of this. Kor's speech at launch continues to show the reverence that he and Worf have for the sword and the bond of friendship that's growing between them, and Worf's own actions continue to show his admiration and respect for the man. I beat on these points because I think it's essential for understanding what will come later. Kor also talks about his dream of them finding the sword and presenting it to the Emperor.
Their statues came to life. Kang and Koloth were flesh and blood again, and we held the sword high.
Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby.
Kang, Koloth, and Kur together again.
Last week, that was Kor in his prime, conquering worlds, trading barbs with Kirk, his every action writing an epic that would bring silent awe even a century later. But today, he's an old man with nothing but tales left. The closest thing he has to a connection to that era is one friend who's reconstituted into a new body, as if he needed any more of a reminder of how times had changed. But to complete this task, recover the single most revered relic in Klingon history, would be his crowning achievement, and maybe mean that he's not just a relic himself. They arrive, breach the defenses, only to discover the place already ransacked. But while Kor laments the loss, Worf scouts around the place, refusing to give up, believing they could find who took it and then track them down. And during his search, he finds evidence of a holographic wall, and he figures out that there is a sensor and comes up with the idea of mimicking one of the aliens who took the sword to gain access. Sure enough, it works, and they discover the sword. Much sooner than expected. Oh, that's why. One of the Duras boys is done showing up. He's going to try to pull a Belloc on them and swipe the sword. He's the little pipsqueak that challenged Gowron's leadership during the Klingon Civil War, and whose life Worf spared. Now he's all grown up, but he's only here because Kor had drunkenly spoken of his quest in a bar full of people, and the Lethian found out everything Kor knew. He plans to take the sword, and with the people rallied around it, take control of the Empire. But our heroes kick his ass and run off, although Worf is wounded, and the jamming signal prevents them from beaming right back up to their runabout. They're going to have to reach the surface. Now, it was planned to make this a perilous escape, with Tomb Raider-style traps along the way that they'd have to deal with, but they were removed because the time involved in setting it all up would have added an extra day to shooting that they couldn't afford to lose. So it went from perilous trip through the caves to walking through the caves. I have mixed feelings about that. On the one hand, since Raiders of the Lost Ark popularized perilous tombs, which in turn was inspired by classic Carl Banks comics, it's become a bit of a cliche. Even the original Indy trilogy only had one long-lost chamber full of traps. Any others were set up and maintained by living people to deal with intruders. Still, I do like to see Trek stretch outside of its normal boundaries from time to time. This is when things start to go wrong for our questers, as Worf and Kor blame each other for this situation. Kor thinking that they might be right about Worf not being truly Klingon, and Worf seeing him as a drunk old man who doesn't know when to keep his mouth shut. While those points are debatable, though Kor drinking from a flask right there in the cave probably clinches Worf's argument, both are right in that if the other had done things differently, they wouldn't be in this situation. So the schism has begun. Worf's annoyed when, after they kill some critter and eat it, Kor retells the tale with heavy embellishment, prompting Kor to remark,
"Well, you better hope that I exaggerate, or else when they start singing songs about this quest and come to your verse, it will be, and Worf came along."
But as you saw, if it hadn't been for Worf, Kor would have just been standing in a dusty room, lamenting his long-lost glory, while the sword sat a mere 10 meters away from him. And yet here he is already diminishing Worf's role and propping up his own. After various speeches, we learn that both believes that with the sword each could gain control of the Empire. Kor because he is a hardened, true-blooded Klingon of legend. Worf because he believes in destiny and had visions that convince him it must be so. One of the criticisms of this episode is that the sword was not directly affecting them. You know, some kind of inverse delta wave inboard-outboard mind screw field or whatever, or some toxin absorbed through the skin when they picked it up, that their behavior seemed so out of the ordinary that it was stupid for it not to have been some kind of influence. Well, character consistency is generally in the eye of the beholder, so I won't disagree with that. But I think the case can be made that the continued reverence shown towards the sword, and more importantly, the continued belief that its very presence can move that many of the Klingon people, is an indication of just how important it is to them. That a symbol can have that much power to sway an empire, yet can be held in one's own hands, is what the corruption is. It's not the sword that's corrupting them. It's the idea of the sword. It's unimaginably powerful. That's what's doing it to them. Look, imagine for a moment that you came across an alien robot somehow. And it's completely indestructible, it's utterly unstoppable, but it's got a small unjammable transmitter that you talk into, and the robot will obey without question or hesitation anything you tell it. You have just suddenly become the most powerful human being on Earth. You could order the robot that if anybody kills you, it must annihilate the world, and no one would dare try to stop you in whatever you chose to do, for fear of retribution. All of that is sitting in your hand. All of that kind of power to do anything you want. You could topple whole governments if you wanted to. Make everybody do what you say because they fear so much what you're capable of doing. The only thing that can be done to strip you of that power is to take away that little transmitter. And after all, if somebody did do that, not only would they be depriving you of that power, but it would be putting it into someone else's hands. Someone who won't use it for good like you believe you're doing. And so by keeping it, you're benefiting the world. You're going to ensure that everything is done right and not wrong. And I hope this analogy might make this a little bit more clear what's going on inside their heads. The sword essentially has this kind of power over the Klingon people. So it's not unreasonable to think that the two men might start considering keeping it for themselves and start mistrusting each other to the degree that they do. This does lead, though, into the most controversial part of the episode, where, as they try crossing a thin ledge, Kor slips and Worf is holding him up by the sword. And Worf tells him there's a ledge to drop on, which, while technically a ledge, it wasn't anything Kor could have landed on and avoided falling to his death. That Worf would be willing to do that rubs some people the wrong way, and again, that's a matter of personal interpretation, but I think Worf's relationship with death, as with most of the Klingons that we see, has a familiarity with it that a momentary slip like this could make him consider letting Kor die. This is the guy who told Picard that if he were anyone else, he'd kill him where he stood, just for insulting him. So imagine what it is if he thinks that he is a threat to his vision of the Klingon Empire. Now, the real sign that Worf has slipped up isn't that he'd want Kor dead. It's the way he's going about it. Killing him with deceit. That's the kind of thing a Romulan would do. That shows he's passed a personal boundary by doing something he would otherwise condemn, likely with a lot of Klingon spittle involved. The two bicker and argue until finally they're attacked by Duras Pipsqueak and friends, who are quickly defeated, but then Worf and Kor turn on each other, and Dax has to finally stun them both. With the jamming field now lowered, they return to the runabout and beam the sword into space, because Worf and Kor realize that if it can turn the two of them against each other, men who place so much in honor and loyalty and friendship, imagine what it would do to the ambitious and corrupt. It's beamed away, but even now Worf clings to his faith.
It could be lost for another 1,000 years.
When it is destined to be found, it will be.
Post-episode follow-up. Annoying character is the Duras Pipsqueak, because he always annoyed me, so showing up here reminds me of how annoyed I am with him. Final score for the Sword of Kahless is 5 out of 10. Don't take that as a slight against it. It just means that it is a typical DS9 episode. Strong on character moments, even while they're stuck on a cave set. Terry Farrell really holds her own in this trying to be the voice of reason amidst the conflict between our Klingon leads, which is going to be difficult because they're really kind of larger than life in these scenes. And the return of Kor was definitely nice. It didn't in any way diminish his last appearance, and it helps to build a bridge to his final appearance, which we'll get to next week in Once More Unto the Breach.
Worf, the traitor, the pariah, the lowest of the low.